How are you today, dear listener? Have you had a long day filled with noise, tasks, or perhaps the gentle rhythm of routine? Before we begin our journey into the quiet past, take a breath with me. This space is not rushed, not urgent. It is here only to guide you softly into rest. If you enjoy wandering through the corridors of time with me, I gently invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the little bell so you'll be reminded when a new History for Sleep story arrives. And since I asked how you are, I would love if you share your answer in the comments below. Tell me if you are listening from the comfort of your bed, or perhaps with headphones on while the night surrounds you. Your voice joins the others here, a small community of sleepless historians who find peace in the past. Tonight, our story begins, not with ruins alone, but with a world once alive and brighter world, deeply connected. Picture the Eastern Mediterranean more than 3,000 years ago. It was not a scattering of lonely kingdoms, each unaware of the other. Instead, it was a web of life, stretched across the sea. Great ships cut across the waters carrying copper, tin, olive oil, and grain. In the bustling harbors, merchants unloaded amphorae, scribes recorded accounts, and sailors prepared to depart again. Think of this as the heartbeat of an interconnected age, steady and rhythmic, pulsing with movement. The palace at Ugarit in Syria knew the court of Mycenae in Greece. Egypt's pharaohs corresponded with kings in Hatti, Babylon, and beyond. This was not isolation, it was communication, trust, and sometimes even rivalry dressed as friendship. A delicate fabric of promises, woven by human hands, stretching across the known world. And in this world, letters were lifelines. Written on clay tablets, pressed with cuneiform, they carried the voices of kings and queens across hundreds of miles. A ruler in Babylon might request gold from Egypt, while another in Anatolia might demand the safe return of merchants. Each letter carried not just words, but expectations, reminders, and veiled warnings. These letters reveal the remarkable reality of this age, that leaders understood their survival was linked to others. They did not exist in splendid isolation, but in constant negotiation. Imagine the quiet hand of a scribe carefully inscribing the symbols, aware that his marks would carry the weight of diplomacy. Once finished, the clay was dried, and in time it was carried by ship or caravan, moving across mountains and seas. A humble object, yet filled with the authority of kings. To us, these tablets are whispers preserved, voices carried across the centuries, still audible if we lean close enough. When we think of the past, we often imagine borders as firm and rigid. But here, in the late Bronze Age, boundaries were porous. A craftsman in Crete could work ivory from Africa, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and gold mined along the Nile. These objects were not mere luxuries, they were proof of belonging to a network of exchange. The royal courts thrived on such gifts, presenting them not only as signs of wealth, but as tokens of friendship, or at times, submission. One king's ivory comb could be another king's assurance of loyalty, and beneath this trade in luxury items, there was also necessity. Grain to feed cities, copper and tin to forge bronze weapons, timber for ships. The interconnectedness of this world was both dazzling and fragile, resting on agreements that could shift with the wind of politics. And yet, while it endured, it created an age of remarkable complexity. So, as you rest tonight, let your imagination drift across that ancient sea. Hear the creak of oars dipping into the water, the rustle of sails filled with wind. Picture lanterns glowing in a distant harbor as sailors unload amphorae by torchlight. A Mycenaean merchant exchanges greetings with a Phoenician trader, their words awkward yet familiar, carried by shared need. In palaces far inland, rulers await news of these journeys, measuring their strength not only by armies, but by the letters and gifts exchanged with distant peers. This was a connected world, as alive with movement and communication as our own. And though its memory drifts softly through time, tonight we cradle it as a lullaby, letting its rhythms ease us into sleep. Beneath the grandeur of kings and palaces, ordinary lives were also shaped by this web of exchange. Farmers in Cyprus grew olives that would be pressed into oil, sealed in jars, and carried across the sea. Shepherds tended flocks whose wool would be spun into cloth for distant markets. Even fishermen along small coastlines played their part, trading catches for grain or tools. These modest contributions were the threads that held the larger fabric together. Imagine a family harvesting olives, not knowing that their labor would end up as part of a gift between two great rulers. The world of the late Bronze Age was not built solely by kings. It was sustained by countless unseen hands. And as night falls for us, we can picture those hands busy in the glow of torchlight, unaware of how far their efforts would travel. The sea itself was a highway, not a barrier. Ships became bridges between cultures, carrying not only goods, but also ideas. A trader from Canaan might bring tales of Egypt to a Greek port. A sailor from Anatolia could hear stories of distant Babylon while docked in Eucrit. These exchanges were subtle yet powerful, weaving shared knowledge into the collective life of the region. Languages mingled, beliefs spread, and technologies traveled silently with the cargo. The loom, the chariot, the craft of metallurgical passed from hand to hand, from coast to coast. This flow of ideas made the late Bronze Age vibrant, alive, and deeply human. And just like the waves that carried ships, this exchange was constant, restless, always in motion. At the heart of this network were letters, claiborne voices of power. These tablets were not casual notes, but deeply symbolic gestures. To send one was to recognize another ruler's legitimacy. To receive one was to be acknowledged as an equal. In many ways, they were contracts, though written in the softest of media clay. Some letters carried warmth, speaking of friendship, family ties through arranged marriages, or requests for lavish gifts. Others carried sharpness, reminders of debts unpaid, or warnings of betrayal. Each letter was a careful balance between politeness and politics. Reading them now is like overhearing the intimate concerns of long-vanished leaders. Their words remind us that human pride, need, and negotiation are timeless. One of the most remarkable discoveries of these letters came from Amarna in Egypt. Buried for centuries beneath sand and ruin, hundreds of tablets were uncovered, their cuneiform marks still sharp. These are the Amarna letters, a treasure trove of late Bronze Age diplomacy. They tell us of kings pleading for gold, of queens arranging marriages, of cities begging for grain during famine. Some are formal, others surprisingly personal, almost tender in tone. Imagine a pharaoh leaning over a tablet, dictating words that would travel across deserts and seas to another palace far away. It is as if the ancient world whispers directly to us, bridging the distance of millennia. And as we read, we realize that the concerns of survival, pride, and hope are not so different from our own. But within these records, there is also fragility. The same letters that boast of alliances also hint at cracks beneath the surface. Pleas for help during poor harvests, disputes over promised gifts, and warnings of raids appear like shadows creeping along the edges of light. It reminds us that this world, though glittering and interconnected, was never immune to pressure. Each promise had weight, and each delay could spark distrust. In the quiet language of clay, we can sense the precarious balance holding everything together. Like a woven net stretched taut, the late Bronze Age was strong only as long as its threads remained unbroken. And even in these moments of strength, the seeds of collapse were already being sown. As we drift further into this age, imagine standing in a palace courtyard at Ugarit. The air is filled with the smell of incense, the sound of scribes scratching symbols into wet clay. Messengers wait with sealed tablets, ready to ride out across dusty roads or sail on the next ship. Each one carries not just a message, but the weight of a kingdom's reputation. To delay a response, or to ignore a letter, was not just impolite, was dangerous. Silence could be read as insult, as weakness, or as defiance. And so the rhythm of letters, gifts, and promises became as vital as the rhythm of harvests or tides. This was a world where power was measured not only by armies, but by connections. Beyond the palace walls, markets buzzed with energy. Traders haggled in many tongues, their goods stacked in baskets and amphorae. You might hear a Canaanite bargaining for Cypriot copper, or an Egyptian seeking fine textiles dyed in purple from Phoenicia. The market was a mirror of the larger world, each exchange a small echo of the royal letters passing between palaces. What happened in the market reflected what happened among kings: negotiation, compromise, and the constant balance of give and take. And for the ordinary people, survival depended on this balance just as much as it did for the rulers. A loaf of bread, a jar of oil, or a coil of bronze, wire were links in the chain of life. It is tempting to think of these connections as purely material, but they carried with them identity and belonging. To drink wine from Crete, or to hold an ivory comb from Africa, was to participate in a shared world. Objects became symbols, not only of wealth, but of status and unity. A queen might wear jewelry from distant lands as proof that her kingdom was not isolated but part of something greater. A warrior's bronze blade was not just a weapon, it was the end result of miners, traders, smiths, and sailors across vast distances. Every object was a testimony to interconnectedness, to unseen hands working together across seas and deserts. This was a cultural fabric as much as an economic one, binding together people who never met, yet whose lives depended on each other. But no network exists without strain. The very letters that kept kings close also revealed the fragility of their bonds. A delay in shipment, a missing caravan, or a failed harvest could ripple outward, shaking trust and creating tension. Imagine a ruler waiting anxiously for a promised shipment of grain, only to hear that pirates attacked the ship, or drought withered the crops. The disappointment was more than personal, it threatened stability. And yet, the letters kept coming, each one a reminder of the effort required to hold the fragile network together. For us, reading these appeals centuries later, there is a strange tenderness in the desperation. It shows how human this grand age truly was. As the night deepens around us, picture those ancient kings lying awake in their palaces. Perhaps they too worried, as we do, over resources, over trust, over the unknown future. Their courtyards may have been filled with luxury, their walls painted with bright colors, yet behind the splendor were doubts carried in the silence of night. They relied on scribes, on merchants, on distant allies, but they also faced the fear of betrayal, of scarcity, of change. And in this sense, their world feels close to ours, separated by time but not by the nature of worry. These letters, these networks, are not just history, they are echoes of familiar human concerns. And in the softness of these echoes, we find a gentle reminder that even the greatest powers once lay awake, wondering what tomorrow would bring. In the glow of torchlight, caravans moved slowly across desert paths. Donkeys, laden with jars and bundles, followed narrow trails that had been traveled for centuries. These caravans were not just merchants, they were lifelines. Grain to feed hungry cities, copper and tin to make bronze, timber for ships, all moved along these routes. Each step carried the weight of kingdoms. To interrupt these paths through war or raid was to cut the veins of the late Bronze Age world. The letters speak often of safe passage, of roads made dangerous, of goods lost to thieves. These small disruptions, when repeated, began to weaken the entire web, and just as a net weakens when too many threads snap, the world of 1177 began to stretch toward breaking. At sea, ships were both majestic and vulnerable. Great hulls carried cargo across waters that glittered by day and turned dark and uncertain by night. Storms could scatter fleets, pirates could descend on unsuspecting sailors. Yet the sea was the fastest, most essential route, and rulers depended on it. To imagine the Mediterranean then is to see it alive with sails, dotted with vessels moving between ports like messengers of fate. On board, sailors whispered prayers to unseen gods, asking for calm winds and safe return. Their journeys were dangerous, but they carried more than goods. They carried the hopes of kings, the stability of nations, and the quiet dreams of families waiting at shorelines. And yet, despite the risks, the system endured for centuries. From the Aegean to Mesopotamia, from Egypt to Anatolia, the exchanges continued. The palaces remained alive with scribes and couriers, merchants and envoys. This persistence shows how strong the network truly was, how deeply embedded in daily life it had become. It was not one trade, one shipment, or one gift that held it together, but thousands, repeated endlessly, like the beating of a heart. This heartbeat is what we hear now in the ruins and in the letters, still faintly audible if we pause to listen. It is the sound of connection, of a world tied together across distance and difference. As centuries passed, however, pressure began to build. Letters grew more urgent, grain more scarce, and the bonds of trust stretched thinner. We, in hindsight, know that collapse waited on the horizon, that 1177 would come to mark an age of unraveling. But for those living within it, the world still seemed alive, still seemed resilient. They continued to send letters, to exchange gifts, to hope that the system would endure. This is part of the lullaby of history, that often decline comes not as a sudden fall, but as a quiet erosion, barely noticed until it has gone too far. The kings and queens of the late Bronze Age lived within the melody, unable to hear the final notes approaching. And so, as you close your eyes tonight, remember this world once connected. Imagine the ships at harbor, the scribes at work, the voices of kings carried on clay tablets across vast distances. Picture the marketplaces alive with voices, the caravans winding across deserts, the sails billowing under stars. This was not a world of isolation, but of threads woven together, strong yet fragile. The story of 1177 begins here, in the beauty of connection and the delicate trust of nations. Let this vision settle around you like a blanket, a reminder that even in history's silence, the echoes of human voices remain. May these echoes guide you gently into rest, carried like a letter across the night. Clay may seem humble to us, simple earth shaped by hand, yet in the late Bronze Age, clay was transformed into something powerful. Soft when wet, it was inscribed with marks that held the voices of kings, queens, merchants, and scribes. Once dried in the sun or baked in a kiln, these tablets became durable records of thought and intention. In a world without paper, without printing, clay was the canvas of diplomacy, the medium of memory. Every letter pressed into the surface was meant to travel across deserts, seas, and time. And astonishingly, thousands have survived, giving us a glimpse into conversations that shaped the fate of empires. Imagine a scribe sitting cross-legged, a lump of clay before him. With a reed stylus, he pressed wedge-shaped signs cuneiformed to the surface. Each stroke mattered, each impression carefully made, for this was no casual note. It carried the authority of a ruler, the weight of promises, or the urgency of need. Once finished, the tablet was dried, wrapped, and sealed with a cylinder stamp that identified its sender. A humble object, perhaps small enough to hold in one hand, yet it was a vessel of power. To send one was to extend your reach across great distances. These tablets were often written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age. Just as English today is used for international affairs, Akkadian linked rulers from Egypt to Anatolia, from Mesopotamia to the Levant. It allowed kings who spoke different tongues to understand one another. The survival of Akkadian as the chosen medium shows the sophistication of their network. To rule a kingdom meant to command not only armies but also words, and Akkadian was the bridge that allowed voices to cross borders. The language of clay was, in truth, the language of connection. The Amarona letters in Egypt reveal this system in vivid detail. Discovered in the late 19th century, these tablets preserve exchanges between the pharaohs and their counterparts abroad. We hear Babylonian kings requesting gold, Mitanni rulers arranging marriages, and Canaanite governors pleading for troops. Each letter is personal, each one alive with the concerns of its time. To read them is to eavesdrop on history itself. They are not abstract records, they are voices, raw and immediate. We sense urgency, pride, and sometimes even exasperation. The clay tablets capture humanity in its most timeless forms. Some letters reveal warmth, calling the recipient brother, affirming friendship, and celebrating kinship through marriage alliances. Others strike a colder tone, demanding repayment or scolding for a delay. A Babylonian king once chided Egypt's pharaoh for sending less gold than promised, insisting that real friendship required generosity. These moments remind us that ancient diplomacy was not so different from today's negotiations. Behind the formal words were emotions, expectation, pride, and sometimes irritation. In these tablets we see rulers not as distant statues, but as people, managing relationships with all their complexity. The letters also reveal the fragile balance of survival. Requests for grain appear often, as cities struggled through years of poor harvests. A desperate plea might read, "Send me grain quickly, that my people may live." Such words, pressed into clay thousands of years ago, still carry their urgency. They remind us that even the mightiest kings were bound by nature, dependent on rains and fertile soil. When crops failed, no army could fill the empty granaries. The clay tablets preserve these vulnerabilities, showing us the humanity beneath the crowns. Transporting these tablets was a delicate process. Couriers carried them in baskets, guarded by soldiers or trusted servants. They traveled by caravan across rugged terrain, or by ship across unpredictable seas. At every stage, there was risk. Bandits, storms, or delays could interrupt the fragile chain of communication. And yet, letters still reached their destinations, proof of the determination to maintain contact. A king could not afford silence. In this way, the clay tablets were lifelines, stretched thin but resilient, binding the kingdoms together. What makes the survival of these letters remarkable is their honesty. Unlike grand inscriptions carved into stone to celebrate victories, these tablets were private, functional, even mundane. They were not meant for the eyes of posterity. That is why they feel so authentic to us now. We are not reading propaganda, we are reading real requests, real negotiations, real frustrations. A pharaoh's words about gold, a governor's cry for troops, a queen's arrangements for marriage, these are pieces of unfiltered history preserved in clay. It is as though we stumbled upon the inbox of an ancient king. Consider how fragile clay can be. Drop a tablet, and it might shatter. Leave it too long in the rain, and it will dissolve. Yet, by some miracle, so many have survived, buried in ruins, sealed in archives, or forgotten in collapsed palaces. Fire, which destroys so much, often saved them, hardening the clay and preserving the words for millennia. What was once written for the eyes of a single ruler now belongs to us all, carried through time by accident and chance. Clay, so unassuming, became eternal. Reading these letters today is like overhearing a conversation carried on the wind. We hear the tone of kings, the anxiety of governors, the pride of rulers boasting of their wealth. Some letters are long, carefully composed. Others are short and urgent, pressed quickly into clay in moments of desperation. Each one brings us closer to the reality of a world deeply interconnected. They remind us that history is not just monuments and battles, but words exchanged between human beings, hoping to be heard. The clay tablets also remind us of the role of scribes. They were the quiet architects of diplomacy, the ones who turned spoken commands into written form. A scribe's hand carried the future of kingdoms. His reed stylus could shape alliances, settle disputes, or plead for survival. These men, often anonymous to us, were indispensable. They were the invisible voices behind the voices, mediators between rulers and history. Without them, the language of clay would have been silent. Their work, though humble, shaped the destiny of empires. At times, letters also carried veiled threats. A ruler might remind another of past promises, or hint that failure to respond could lead to war. Even wrapped in formal words, the meaning was clear. Clay could carry not just requests, but warnings, sharp as swords. These moments show that the language of clay was not always gentle. It could also be an instrument of power. A message pressed into earth could weigh as heavily as an army at the border. Words mattered, and rulers knew it, but alongside tension, there was intimacy. Some letters read almost like family correspondence. A father-in-law wrote to his royal son-in-law about dowries and obligations. A sister queen asked for gifts of fine cloth or ivory. These letters show us that the royal families of the ancient world were tied together by marriage, weaving bonds that were both personal and political. Behind the formality lay the familiar rhythms of family life. The clay carried not only statecraft, but the daily concerns of kinship. As the late Bronze Age world stretched across vast distances, clay letters gave it cohesion. They were threads binding together palaces, cities, and courts. Without them, the network might have frayed sooner. Their words gave reassurance, confirmed trust, and kept rulers informed of distant events. In a sense, they were the nervous system of the age, carrying signals across the body of the Mediterranean world. When we hold them now, we hold the nervous system itself, frozen in time but still alive with energy. The clay letters were not only practical but symbolic. To send one was to affirm participation in the great system of kings. A ruler who ignored them cut himself off from legitimacy. In this way, clay was not just a medium of communication, It was a symbol of belonging. It marked the difference between a great king and a provincial chief. The very act of sending and receiving letters was proof of standing in the interconnected order of the age. Clay was both humble and regal, both ordinary and sacred. One cannot help but imagine the emotions of those who waited for replies. A king might pace his hall, wondering if his request for gold would be honored. A governor might scan the horizon for a courier carrying news of reinforcements. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, as the fragile clay moved across vast distances. The waiting itself must have been heavy, filled with uncertainty. And yet, when a letter finally arrived, it carried not just words, but relief, connection, and the reassurance that the network was still alive. For modern historians, these letters are a gift beyond measure. They open a window into a time otherwise silent. Without them, we would know little of the daily concerns of the late Bronze Age rulers. With them, we hear voices. We glimpse not only the structures of power, but the emotions of those who held it. That is why the language of clay matters. It transforms history from cold ruins into warm conversation, into whispers we can still hear beneath the dust. But there is also sadness in reading them. Many of the letters speak from moments close to the collapse. Requests for aid unanswered, warnings ignored, pleas for grain too late. They carry the weight of a world about to unravel, though their writers did not know it. For us, the letters are bittersweet, because we know the ending they could not. They believed in the strength of their connections, even as those connections were fraying. Their words remain, preserved in clay, long after their cities fell silent. Tonight, as you listen, let the language of clay drift into your thoughts. Picture the hands pressing symbols into soft earth, the careful seal of a king, the long journey of a courier across desert and sea. Imagine the relief of a ruler opening a tablet, reading words from a distant ally, feeling for a moment less alone. Clay carried voices across time and carries them still. And in the quiet of night, those voices whisper again, not to demand or to plead, but simply to remind us of their fragile, connected world. Their lullaby is written in earth itself, and it hums softly as you drift towards sleep. The city of Amarna rests today in quiet ruins along the Nile. Once, it was the capital of Pharaoh Akhenaten, who sought to reshape Egypt's religion. But beyond the drama of gods and temples, Amarna held something unexpected, an archive buried in its soil. Hundreds of clay tablets survived, the correspondence between Egypt and the wider world. These are the Amarna letters, a window unlike any other into the late Bronze Age. They do not boast of victories or carve propaganda in stone. Instead, they preserve conversations, fragile and human, carried across borders in clay. Discovered in the late 19th century, the tablets stunned scholars. Here were voices of kings from Babylon, Hatti, Mitanni, and beyond. They wrote to Egypt as equals, calling the pharaoh brother, affirming alliances, and demanding gifts. Governors from Canaanite cities also appear, their voices smaller but more desperate, pleading for soldiers or grain. These letters revealed not only Egypt's place in the world, but also the network of trust that bound the Eastern Mediterranean together. They are not myth or legend, they are evidence, direct and unfiltered. Reading them feels like overhearing the anxieties of an age. Imagine a pharaoh sitting in a painted hall, receiving a clay tablet from a courier. The seal is broken, the cuneiform symbols read aloud by a trained scribe. The words might praise his greatness, or they might criticize his stinginess. Perhaps they bring news of famine abroad, or reports of raids near the borders. The pharaoh listens, frowning, nodding, weighing his response. Then he dictates his reply, words once again pressed into clay and sent across deserts and seas. This rhythm of request and reply was the heartbeat of diplomacy. And Amarna, by chance, preserved it all. Some letters are filled with warmth. A king in Babylon wrote to Egypt with affectionate greetings, recalling earlier exchanges of daughters in marriage, affirming kinship as well as politics. Others are sharp, accusing Egypt of neglect or warning of broken promises. One king scolds the pharaoh for sending gilded wood instead of solid gold, calling it unworthy of friendship. These disputes remind us that diplomacy was not smooth. It was often fraught with pride and expectation clashing beneath the formal words. The Amarna letters reveal rulers not as perfect symbols, but as people with egos, needs, and tempers. Among the smaller voices, the letters of Canaanite governors are striking. Their words are urgent, sometimes frantic, begging Egypt for aid. They describe raids, rivalries, and cities at risk of falling. In their voices we hear the fragility of frontier life, the constant fear of being abandoned by distant powers. "Why do you not send troops?" one governor asks, his tone desperate. These small tablets preserve the voices of men who stood at the edge of empire, aware that their survival depended on forces far beyond their walls. The Amarna letters also remind us of the slowness of communication. A plea for soldiers might take weeks or months to reach the pharaoh. By the time a reply was written, the situation could already have changed. Imagine waiting for help that might never arrive, each day scanning the horizon for Egyptian banners. In some cases, no aid came and the cities fell. The letters remain as testimony, frozen appeals for help unanswered by history. They are haunting not because of what they achieved, but because of what they could not. There is also tenderness in some of these tablets. Queens wrote to one another, asking for gifts of cloth, ivory, or perfumes. Their words carry a tone both polite and personal, revealing a side of diplomacy often forgotten. These exchanges remind us that women, too, played vital roles in maintaining the bonds of the age. They used the language of kinship, of sisterhood, weaving threads of stability across borders. The clay holds not only power, but also intimacy. In these voices, we sense the everyday texture of royal life, soft amid the politics. For modern historians, the Amarna archive is invaluable. Without it, our knowledge of late Bronze Age diplomacy would be fragmentary. With it, we glimpse a living system, a world of correspondence, alive with energy. Each letter confirms that the great kingdoms did not exist in isolation. They were bound together in constant communication, their fortunes tied to one another's choices. The Amarna letters are proof that history was a dialogue, not a series of disconnected events. And though the clay is silent now, the words still resonate with clarity. What is striking is how ordinary these concerns can feel. A ruler frustrated at not receiving enough gold. A governor begging for food to feed his people. A queen requesting fine clothes for her daughter's wedding. These are problems that feel human, relatable, even now. They show that behind crowns and titles, rulers shared the same concerns we might recognize today. Pride, hunger, family, survival. The Amarna echo is not distant, it is close, whispering of humanity across millennia. At times, the letters even carry humor. A Babylonian king joked about the pharaoh's stinginess, teasing him as if they were old friends. These small moments sparkle amid the heavier concerns, showing that even kings could laugh, complain, and banter. Such fragments make the past feel warm, alive, not frozen in stone. The clay becomes more than an artifact. it becomes a vessel of personality. To hear a king's voice joking across thousands of years is to be reminded that history is never as silent as it seems. But there is an undertone of fragility that runs through the Amarna archive. For all the exchanges of gifts and words, many letters reveal cracks in the system. Governors begged for troops that never came. Alliances strained under the weight of broken promises. Food shortages crept across the land, echoing from one kingdom to the next. The letters preserve the sound of a world holding together, but only just. They are the echo before the collapse, faint yet unmistakable. Picture, if you will, the scribes who recorded these words, their reed stylus scratched into clay as they transcribed the voice of their king. Perhaps they worked late into the evening by flickering lamplight, aware that every stroke carried importance. Did they sense that their work would outlive empires? That their careful marks would one day be read not by kings, but by strangers far in the future? The Amarna echo is as much their legacy as it is the rulers'. Their invisible hands shaped the sound of history. The discovery of the Amarna letters was almost accidental. Villagers stumbled upon the tablets in the 1880s, pulling them from the earth where they had rested for over 3 millennia. Scholars rushed to translate them, realizing their significance. Suddenly, the late Bronze Age spoke with new clarity, its whispers preserved in clay. What had once been silence became conversation. The ruins of Amarna, forgotten for centuries, now gave us not monuments, but words. And words, more than stone, carry the human soul. For Egypt, the archive showed its place at the center of a vast web. Every letter arriving from abroad affirmed Egypt's role as a great power. Yet they also revealed Egypt's vulnerabilities, delays, shortages, and strained promises. The pharaohs might appear immortal in temples, but in the clay, they were fallible, human, and sometimes uncertain. The Amarna echo balances grandeur with humility, showing us both strength and fragility. And in this balance, we glimpse the truth of history. The Amarna letters do more than inform, they connect. Reading them, we feel the presence of real people across the gulf of time. They remind us that history is not abstract, but alive with voices. To listen is to honor them, to give shape once more to their words. They are echoes that reach us across 30 centuries, carrying with them the warmth of humanity. Even in their desperation, there is comfort, the reassurance that people have always sought connection, always reached outward in trust. In the quiet of night, these echoes feel especially strong. They are not loud proclamations, but soft voices, steady and human, as you rest. Imagine them carried on the wind, the king of Babylon calling the pharaoh brother, the governor of Byblus pleading for soldiers, the queen of Mitanni sending a gift of cloth. Each voice adds to the chorus, a lullaby of connection. This is the Amarna echo, not gone, but lingering, waiting for us to listen. And tonight, in this gentle story, you have listened. So let the echoes drift around you as you close your eyes. The voices of kings and queens, of scribes and governors, whisper in the dark, preserved in clay. They speak not to demand, but to remind us of the fragility and beauty of human connection. And as you fall into rest, let their lullaby guide you. For though their empires have long since vanished, their words endure, carried softly through time, reaching us here, now, in the quiet of night. In the late Bronze Age, diplomacy was not only written in clay, but also displayed in objects of beauty. To send a letter without a gift was like whispering without sound. Rulers measured the strength of their alliances not only in words, but in the gleam of gold, the shimmer of cloth, the weight of ivory. Gifts were symbols, tokens of respect, instruments of persuasion. They traveled alongside letters, each one chosen carefully to speak louder than ink or clay could ever manage. Egypt, rich with its golden deserts, often sent treasure to other courts. Pharaohs boasted of their mines and their endless reserves of the precious metal. To receive Egyptian gold was to hold the very sun in your hands, a reminder of Egypt's radiance. Yet other kingdoms had their own treasures. From the east came lapis lazuli, deep blue like the night sky, carried from distant Afghanistan. From Africa came ivory, carved into combs and ornaments. From the Levant came fine textiles, dyed in purple, drawn from the shells of tiny sea creatures. Each gift was not just wealthy, it was identity. The letters show us that these exchanges were more than pleasantries. They were obligations, heavy with expectation. A Babylonian king once complained bitterly that the pharaoh sent him gilded wood instead of solid gold, accusing him of dishonoring their friendship. Another ruler scolded Egypt for sending too few gifts, reminding him that generosity was proof of alliance. These moments reveal the delicate balance of pride and need. Gifts carried meaning deeper than their material worth. They were the very language of trust. Marriage alliances were often sealed with treasures. A daughter sent abroad to wed a distant king carried with her dowries of gold, textiles, and gems. These were not simply tokens of affection, but contracts woven into objects. When a princess crossed the sea, she carried with her not only beauty but wealth, binding her family's honor to her new home. Gifts reinforced the ties of kinship, turning personal unions into political guarantees. The sparkle of gold on her wrists was also the sparkle of diplomacy. But gifts could also become weapons. To withhold them was to insult. To send them sparingly was to show displeasure. A king might measure the state of his friendship by the weight of a chest delivered from abroad. If it was too light, suspicion grew. If it was abundant, trust was renewed. In this way, diplomacy was played out not only in words, but in the silent glitter of objects. The clay letters recorded the complaints, but the gifts themselves carried the true message. Imagine the caravans that carried these treasures. Donkeys loaded with ivory tusks, chests of gold, and baskets of cloth trudged across deserts, guided by weary servants. Sailors lifted crates onto ships, securing them with rope as the vessels swayed on the waves. At every step, the value was enormous, the risk great. A lost shipment was more than lost. Wealth it was a broken promise. And so each journey was a gamble, played not with coins but with trust itself. The arrival of a gift was a moment of ceremony. In palace courtyards, treasures were unveiled before the ruler and his court. Gold glittered in torchlight, cloth shimmered with dye, carved ivory seemed to glow like bone turned to light. Courtiers gasped, envoys bowed, scribes recorded every detail. The gift was not simply received, was displayed, honored, remembered, and later, when letters were exchanged again, the gift would be mentioned, praised, or criticized, its memory lingering in clay. Some gifts carried stories within them. A lapis seal might have traveled thousands of miles, crossing mountains, rivers, and seas before arriving in a palace chest. A piece of ivory might remind its bearer of distant lands where elephants roamed. These objects were more than symbols. They were travelers themselves, silent witnesses to the journey of the age. They embodied the connections between cultures, the threads of the web stretching across the world. Each one was a quiet ambassador of its land. The balance of gifts reflected the balance of power. To send too little was weakness. To receive too much without reciprocation was arrogance. Rulers measured one another through these exchanges, aware that gifts could strengthen or strain alliances. In this delicate economy, generosity was a form of weaponry. A king who could send lavish treasures declared his strength without lifting a sword. A king who failed revealed his fragility. The language of gifts was subtle, yet it spoke volumes. Even among equals, rivalry lurked beneath the surface. Each ruler wanted his gift to surpass the last. Each wanted to be known as generous, powerful, unchallenged in wealth. This competition sometimes bred resentment, as kings measured not only the gifts they gave but those they received. In this way, diplomacy was a constant game of balance, played not only with soldiers but with treasures. The letters we have are filled with this quiet tension, preserved in the clay like echoes of rivalry. For the ordinary people who made these objects, the stakes were invisible. The craftsman carving ivory, the weaver spinning fine cloth, the miner digging gold from the earth, none could know that their work would shape alliances between empires. Their hands created the symbols of trust, the tokens of power. Though history remembers the kings, the true makers of diplomacy were often anonymous artisans, their skill shaping the course of nations. In their quiet labor, history was written. The fragility of this system is easy to see in hindsight. As resources grew scarce, gifts became harder to send. Letters reveal complaints of delayed shipments, of treasures arriving in poor condition, of promises unfulfilled. Trust frayed when gold ran thin, when ivory could not be spared, when cloth was too costly to weave. Diplomacy depended on abundance, and abundance was never guaranteed. The very symbols of connection became symbols of strain. The echoes of these gifts can still be seen in the ground. Archaeologists uncover fragments of ivory, beads of lapis, traces of gold. Each one tells a story of a gift once treasured, now forgotten in the soil. To hold such an object is to feel the weight of a promise long broken, a bond once celebrated but now dissolved. These fragments are the ruins of diplomacy, as real as the fallen walls of palaces. And yet, even in ruin, there is beauty. The shine of a bead, the delicate carving of ivory, the shimmer of a textile, thread-edged detail reminds us of the artistry that once carried the weight of kings. These objects, though broken, still whisper of their journeys. They tell us that history was lived not only in clay and stone, but in gold and cloth, in the textures of human creation. The gifts remain, silent yet eloquent, their language still alive. Diplomacy by gift was both fragile and enduring. Fragile because it relied on resources that could vanish, on trust that could falter. Enduring because even in collapse, the memory of gifts lingers. We remember the Babylonian king's complaint, the pharaoh's boast, the queen's request. Their words, preserved in clay, keep the glitter of gold alive in our imagination. The objects themselves may be scattered, but the stories they carried remain intact. Think of it tonight as you rest. A world where diplomacy was wrapped in silk, weighed in gold, carved in ivory, where gifts spoke louder than armies, where generosity was a form of power. In that age, to give was to rule, and to receive was to belong. It was a language spoken without words, heard across seas and deserts. And though that world has long since faded, its lullaby continues, soft and shimmering, guiding us gently into sleep. Drought is not always sudden. Sometimes it creeps slowly, year after year, reducing harvests little by little until the land itself seems weary. In the late Bronze Age, signs of a changing climate began to appear. Letters preserved in clay mention failed crops, hungry cities, and desperate pleas for grain. Imagine a governor writing to the pharaoh, pressing symbols into clay with urgency, begging for food so his people would not starve. These were not abstract concerns, they were survival itself. And behind the royal courts, countless farmers felt the strain first, watching the skies with hope, waiting for rains that never came. Each dry season weakened the web of connection. Food was not just nourishment, it was the foundation of diplomacy, the resource that made gifts, trade, and trust possible. Without it, even kings could not maintain their bonds. Picture the fields of Canaan, where wheat once swayed in the breeze. In times of drought, those fields grew thin, stalks brittle, soil cracked. Farmers tried to coax life from the earth, but the rains failed. In Cyprus, olive groves yielded less oil. In Anatolia, herds thinned. This was a crisis without armies or enemies. Nature itself had turned against the people. The letters capture the desperation. A governor might write, "Send me grain quickly, that my people may live." To us, these words are haunting, because they reveal hunger written into clay. They show that beneath the glitter of palaces, the foundation of society was fragile. Food was wealth, and in its absence, no gift of gold could satisfy. Drought was an invisible invader, sapping strength silently. The drought carried with it more than hunger, it carried fear. When crops failed, famine spread, and when famine spread, unrest followed. Hungry people grew desperate, and desperate people could not be governed easily. Letters show rulers scrambling to keep order, appealing to allies for shipments of grain. But when everyone suffered, generosity grew thin. A shipment promised might arrive too late, or not at all, and in that silence, bonds of trust weakened. What use was a brother king if he could not spare food? What worth was an alliance if the granaries remained empty? The drought tested not only the soil, but the very fabric of diplomacy. It pulled at every thread until the web began to fray. In Egypt, the Nile was both blessing and risk. Its annual floods made the land fertile, but when they faltered, harvests collapsed. Pharaohs had long relied on the Nile to feed their people and supply their allies abroad. But even mighty Egypt was not immune. Letters speak of shortages, of limited shipments, of rulers angry at receiving less than expected. Imagine the strain of balancing domestic needs against international promises. A pharaoh could not appear weak, yet he could not conjure grain from dry soil. The weight of drought pressed upon him, just as it pressed upon every ruler. And each tablet, each request, shows us that the crisis was shared across borders, no land entirely safe. The drought was a chain reaction, felt in every court and every home. Beyond the letters, the archaeology confirms what the clay whispers. Pollen records, lake sediments, and tree rings tell us that rains grew scarce during this era. The science aligns with the history. The land was drying, the harvests shrinking. Farmers abandoned fields, herds dwindled, populations weakened. And in this fragile state, even small shocks could prove devastating. A raid, a lost shipment, a delayed caravan became heavier burdens when stomachs were already empty. The letters of rulers and the science of today, together, create a chorus of warning. They remind us that climate is never background, it is a player in history. And in the late Bronze Age, drought stepped onto the stage as a powerful force. The drought also changed the nature of gifts. Where once gold and ivory had been tokens of friendship, grain became the true treasure. A shipment of food was worth more than chests of jewels. To send grain was to offer life itself. And yet, scarcity made such gifts harder to give. A king might hesitate, knowing his own people faced hunger. And so letters turned sharper, filled with reproach, each side accusing the other of selfishness. Diplomacy that once glittered in gold now crumbled in the dust of hunger. This shift reveals the fragility of abundance. When food ran short, the rituals of exchange could not survive unchanged. The drought had rewritten the script. The weight of drought was felt not only in fields but also in kitchens. Imagine families gathered around small hearths, stretching meager supplies, sharing bread that grew thinner each day. The ordinary people who rarely appear in letters carried the heaviest burden. Their hunger echoed upward, straining rulers who feared unrest. Grain riots were not carved into monuments, but they shaped history all the same. When the soil failed, the entire order trembled, and so, behind every royal plea for grain was the silent suffering of countless households. Their voices remain unheard, but their struggle is etched in absence-empty jars, barren fields, lives cut short. The drought was not just a crisis of kings, but of everyone. Letters show us that food was also a weapon. A ruler who controlled surplus grain could wield it like an army. To withhold it was to weaken an ally. To release it was to gain loyalty. In this sense, granaries became fortresses, their gates guarded more tightly than city walls. To promise grain and fail to deliver was to invite anger, suspicion, or even revolt. Thus, the drought did not only starve bodies, it starved trust. Diplomacy, once adorned with gold and gifts, became bound by bread. And when bread failed, peace failed with it. Hunger was sharper than any sword, and it cut through the bonds of brotherhood. The drought also reshaped migration. When fields could not feed families, people moved. Entire groups left their homes, seeking lands where water still flowed and soil remained fertile. These migrations placed pressure on neighboring kingdoms, already struggling with their own scarcity. Refugees arrived at gates, not as invaders, but as survivors, yet their presence strained resources further. Some were welcomed, others resisted, but all altered the delicate balance of the region. Drought was not a border, it was a wave, pushing populations into new lands, reshaping maps silently. In its wake, tensions grew as kings faced challenges they had never expected. Hunger had made the world restless. We can picture the long caravans of desperate families, carrying only what they could on their backs. They followed the hope of rain, of fertile ground, of safety. Behind them, abandoned villages lay silent, their fields overgrown, their wells dry. These migrations are harder to trace in letters, but archaeology hints at them. Settlements shrinking in one place, growing suddenly in another. New pottery styles appearing far from their origin, carried by hands that fled famine. The drought was not only written in clay, was written in the movement of people across the land, and each step they took added to the strain of a world already stretched too thin. Kings, in their palaces, felt the pressure differently. They read letters demanding food, weighed shipments against their own stores, and feared the shame of refusing. To fail an ally was to risk war. To give too much was to risk weakness at home. This impossible balance haunted them. Imagine a ruler lying awake, hearing the empty echo of his own granaries, wondering which promise he could afford to keep. His choices were cruel. Save his own people or maintain his alliances. The drought forced decisions with no mercy, and every choice carried consequences. Power itself began to crack under the weight of hunger. In the letters, desperation grows sharper as the years pass. We read not only of requests for grain, but of repeated requests, reminders, and complaints. Why do you delay? One governor asks. Why do you withhold what is promised? These words are not only political, they are echoes of starving cities. They remind us that diplomacy was not abstract, but visceral, grounded in the gnawing emptiness of hunger. When rulers failed to act, their neglect was measured not in loss of honor, but in lives lost. Each tablet carries within it the urgency of survival, and that urgency was growing unbearable. The drought also revealed the limits of empire. Egypt, Hatti, Babylon seemed vast and powerful, yet none could control the weather, none could command the skies. Their armies, their gold, their monuments whole, were powerless before the absence of rain. In this way, drought humbled them, reminding rulers that their strength rested on fragile foundations. A palace may glitter, but if the fields surrounding it wither, the palace cannot stand for long. In the language of climate, even empires were small, and the letters show us that the kings knew it. They begged as much as they commanded, humbled by hunger. As the drought deepened, its ripple effects spread into every corner of life. Temples saw fewer offerings as resources dwindled. Artisans lost work as luxuries were abandoned in favor of necessities. Soldiers grumbled when rations thinned, their loyalty tested by empty stomachs. The entire machinery of the state slowed, strained by scarcity. What had once been abundance turned to fragility, and fragility, when stretched too far, leads to collapse. The drought was not only a natural disaster, it was a slow unraveling of the systems that made the late Bronze Age thrive. It was history's quiet dismantling, felt in silence more than in battle. The archaeology gives us haunting images of this decline. Storage jars once filled with grain are found empty, their interiors stained but bare. Villagers once busy with harvests show signs of abandonment. Skeletons hint at malnutrition, bones thinner, weaker, marked by hunger. The land itself records the silence, the absence of cultivation, the retreat of life. Science and history together confirm what the letters tell us, that hunger walked hand in hand with power in this age. It stalked kings as well as peasants, sparing none entirely. The drought was universal, and its shadow stretched across the entire region. One striking detail in the letters is how often rulers appealed to brotherhood. "My brother, send me grain," they would write. The word brother was heavy with meaning, a reminder of kinship, of obligation, of shared survival. But hunger strained even brotherhood. Promises made in abundance became harder to keep in scarcity. And so the language of family became the language of disappointment. To be denied grain was not only political failure, it was betrayal. These letters carry not just hunger, but heartbreak. They show us how scarcity corrodes even the strongest of bonds. The drought also left its mark on trade. Merchants carried fewer goods. Ships left harbors less full. Caravans struggled to find supplies for the road. Markets grew quieter, their stalls empty, their voices subdued. Trade, once vibrant and alive, became hesitant, fragile. And as trade slowed, the connections between kingdoms weakened further. The drought was not only a crisis of food, it was a crisis of connection. It shrank the web that had once bound the world together. Each empty stall, each delayed caravan, was another thread lost, and the network itself began to unravel. For the people living through it, the drought must have seemed endless. Each year brought hope of rain, and each year disappointment. The skies grew more silent, the fields more barren. Generations felt its weight, children growing up with hunger as a companion. It is difficult for us to imagine the despair of such persistence, but the letters give us a glimpse. Each plea for grain, each warning of famine, is not a single moment, but part of a long struggle. The drought was not a passing storm, which was a season stretched into years. When we listen to these voices today, they carry both immediacy and distance. Immediacy, because their words are clear, their hunger still recognizable. Distance, because their world has vanished, their cities turned to dust. Yet the drought bridges that distance. It reminds us that survival has always been fragile, that climate has always shaped history. The kings of the late Bronze Age were no different from us. They looked to the sky, they prayed for rain, they feared what they could not control. Their voices remain, carried in clay, telling us of hunger across time. And so, the weight of drought becomes part of the lullaby of 1177. It is not a lullaby of comfort, but of truth, a reminder that history is not always shaped by battles or crowns. Sometimes it is shaped by skies that refuse to rain, by fields that fall silent, by hunger that grows louder than armies. Tonight, as you rest, imagine those ancient fields, cracked and barren, and the people who once waited for rain. Their voices are soft now, but they remain carried to us in clay. Let their quiet plea settle in the night, reminding us of fragility and guiding us gently into sleep. The sea, once the lifeline of the late Bronze Age, also became its greatest vulnerability. For centuries, ships had carried copper, tin, oil, and grain across the Mediterranean, weaving kingdoms together in prosperity. But by the late 13th century BCE, new shadows appeared upon the horizon. Raiders, whom we now call the Sea Peoples, began to arrive at coastlines. Their names are uncertain, their origins debated, but their presence was undeniable. They struck with sudden violence, burning harbors, toppling cities, and leaving silence where once there had been trade. The sea that had united became the sea that divided. Imagine standing on a coastal wall at dusk. Far out, sails appear, black against the fading sun. At first they might seem like traders, bringing goods from afar. But soon smoke rises from the next city down the coast. Refugees stream inland, carrying nothing but their lives. Fear spreads faster than the ships themselves. For kingdoms already weakened by famine and drought, these raids were devastating. A single attack could sever trade routes, empty markets, and leave rulers powerless. The raiders at the shore became a spectre haunting the entire region. The letters hint at these attacks, though often indirectly. A governor might write of enemies at his gates, or of ships appearing without warning. Some plead for reinforcements, others simply cry for help. Archaeology fills in the gaps. Burned layers in coastal cities, collapsed walls, skeletons left in the ruins. These traces tell us what the clay could not always record: the violence of the seaborne threat. The Sea Peoples, whoever they were, reshaped the balance of power. They were not bound by the rules of diplomacy, not tied by the obligations of gift and letter. They struck where the bonds were weakest. Egyptian records speak of these raiders with drama. Pharaohs carved images of battles against strange warriors with feathered headdresses, their ships drawn in vivid detail. These inscriptions boast of victories, but the very fact they were recorded shows the scale of the threat. Egypt, the mighty power of the Nile, felt compelled to warn of outsiders pressing against its shores. The Sea Peoples were not a passing nuisance, they were a storm at the edges of empire. And, as other kingdoms fell, Egypt itself stood nearly alone, bracing against the tide. The raids did not only bring destruction, they brought displacement. As cities burned, survivors fled inland, creating waves of migration. Populations shifted, villages swelled, resources grew strained. The raiders at the shore were not just fighters, they were catalysts, pushing people into motion, tearing apart the delicate balance that had defined the late Bronze Age. The letters grow quieter in this period, fewer and more desperate, as if the very network of communication was collapsing under pressure. Silence, in history, is sometimes the loudest sound of all. Archaeologists uncover sudden abandonments of once thriving ports. Ugarit, for example, shows signs of hurried flight letters, half-baked in kilns, never delivered, left behind in ashes. Ships never returned, goods never reached their destinations. This is collapse, not written in grand inscriptions, but in absence. The absence of trade, of voices, of life. The sea peoples became part of that absence, the shadow behind the silence. They are remembered less for who they were, and more for what they left behind. The image of coastal flames is a powerful one. Imagine looking out across the night sea, the horizon lit red by burning towns. The cries of survivors mix with the crash of waves. Merchants who once carried goods now carry news of destruction, spreading fear faster than ships can sail. A single raid becomes a legend, retold in whispers in distant markets. And soon, the sea that once carried trust now carried terror. This transformation reshaped the psychology of the age. The sea was no longer a lifeline, but a frontier. The identity of the sea peoples remains uncertain. Were they migrants fleeing drought and famine? Were they mercenaries, former allies turned to plunder when the system faltered? Or were they entirely new groups, pressing in from beyond the known world? The truth may be all of these at once. What matters is the impact. Kingdoms unprepared for such mobility, such sudden violence, found themselves vulnerable. The sea peoples became a symbol of instability, of the collapse of rules that had once bound the Mediterranean together. Even mighty empires struggled against them. Egypt claimed victories, but at heavy cost. Other kingdoms simply vanished from record. Hatti, once powerful in Anatolia, disappears in this period. Coastal cities that had thrived for centuries fell silent, their walls blackened, their archives buried in ruin. The raiders did not build, they unbuilt. They were part of the great unweaving of the age, and though we cannot name them with certainty, their actions are inscribed into the archaeology of fire and ash. They were the storm at the edges of the world. Consider the sailors who faced them. Merchants setting out with cargo could not know if they would reach their destination. Harbors that had once been safe might now be hostile. Trust in the sea, so vital to the late Bronze Age, evaporated. Trade slowed, then faltered, as fear outweighed profit. The raiders turned the Mediterranean from a web of connection into a field of danger. And in that shift, the network unraveled further. The sea itself became a weapon against those who once relied upon it. The impact on ordinary people was profound. Fishermen found their waters unsafe, traders their routes disrupted, coastal farmers their villages threatened. Refugees carried stories inland, tales of ships appearing like shadows, of homes lost overnight. Fear spread like a tide, reaching even those who lived far from the shore. The raids did not only destroy, they unsettled, creating uncertainty everywhere. And in an interconnected world, uncertainty was poison. It corroded trust, slowed exchange, and left rulers paralyzed. The raiders were more than invaders. They were a psychological force. Egyptian carvings show pharaohs confronting these sea-borne enemies, their ships locked in battle. The scenes are stylized, of course, yet they tell us that the threat was memorable enough to carve in stone. To Egypt, The sea peoples were an enemy worth defining, an other against which to declare strength. But the very act of carving also betrays anxiety. Egypt wanted to assure its people, and perhaps itself, that the threat could be contained. History, however, tells us that few others were so fortunate. For many kingdoms, the raiders at the shore marked the beginning of the end. The silence of the letters during this period is chilling. Where once there had been constant communication, archives grow sparse. Cities that once wrote to Egypt or Babylon vanish from record. Their voices were silenced, not by choice, but by destruction. To hold a half-baked tablet from Ugarit is to hold a frozen moment, a letter that never reached its destination, cut short by flames. The sea peoples became the interruption, the sudden stop in a chorus of voices. They were the break in history's song. Historians debate whether the sea peoples alone caused the collapse. Most now agree they were part of a wider storm: drought, famine, migration, and war all together. Yet their raids symbolized the breaking point, the moment when fragile systems could no longer hold. They remind us that collapse is rarely caused by one force alone. It is the convergence of many pressures, arriving all at once, overwhelming resilience. The sea peoples were one such pressure, sharp and sudden, tearing through an already weakened world. In myth and memory, raiders often become monsters. To those who survived, the sea peoples likely seemed unstoppable, arriving like waves themselves, relentless and destructive. Their image has lasted, even as their names are lost. They embody the fear of the sea turning hostile, of strangers at the horizon bringing only fire. And though we seek to study them calmly now, their presence in history remains unsettling. They were not simply people, they were a force of disruption. A force the late Bronze Age could not withstand, and yet, within this destruction, there was survival. Egypt endured, scarred but standing. Some inland kingdoms adapted, shifting their centers of power away from the vulnerable coasts. The collapse was not total, not immediate, but it was irreversible. The world that had thrived on maritime exchange was gone. In its place rose something quieter, more fragmented, less connected. The raiders at the shore had played their part in ending one age and beginning another. Their legacy is the silence after the storm. Tonight, as you rest, imagine the horizon of that age. A sea once glittering with trade, now shadowed by sails of fear. Cities once filled with voices, now silent, their ashes cooling under the stars. And yet, within the ruins, life continued, families rebuilt, children grew, kingdoms adapted. The raiders at the shore remind us that even in collapse, there is continuity. History does not end, it shifts, reshapes, renews, and in the gentle quiet of night, that truth can lull us towards sleep. So let the sound of waves guide you now, not the crashing waves of fear, but the softer rhythm of the sea at peace. The raiders are gone, their names forgotten, their fires long cooled. What remains is the lesson that networks, no matter how strong, can be undone by hunger, by drought, by strangers on the shore. And yet, in remembering them, we give shape to the past, honoring the voices lost to silence. Let their memory drift like a tide, carrying you gently into rest. The palaces of the late Bronze Age were more than homes for kings. They were centers of power, of administration, of ceremony, of memory. In places like Mycenae, Hattusa, and Ugarit, their walls rose high, decorated with frescoes, their courtyards filled with the bustle of scribes, artisans, and envoys. These palaces were alive, beating hearts of their kingdoms, humming with activity that touched every part of life. But in time, these same palaces grew silent. Fire, neglect, and abandonment stripped them of voices. What had once been vibrant became still. The transition from noise to silence is at the core of the late Bronze Age collapse. And it is in this silence that history lingers, reminding us how quickly grandeur can fade. Imagine walking through the ruins of Mycenae after its fall. Halls once filled with feasting nobles now echo only with the wind. Storerooms, once heavy with jars of oil and grain, stand empty, their shelves broken. Walls that once bore bright murals now crumble, their colors faded to pale shadows. In the ashes we find fragments of luxury jewelry, pottery, tools abandoned in haste. These ruins tell us that the end came not with careful planning but with suddenness. Palaces fell in fire, their residents fleeing or perishing, their voices silenced in an instant. The silence after such violence must have felt overwhelming. It is this silence that archaeology uncovers today. The silence of the palaces was not only physical but political. Kings who once commanded vast networks found their authority gone. Without palaces, there were no archives, no scribes, no bureaucracies. The letters stopped, the gifts ceased, the networks dissolved. Authority had rested within these walls, and when the walls fell, so too did the power they contained. The collapse of palaces was the collapse of order. The silence meant not just the end of music and feasts, but the end of governance itself. To live in such silence was to live in a world unmoored. At Ugarit, the silence is captured in the most haunting way. Letters found in the ruins were half-baked, abandoned mid-process. A final message pleaded for aid, warning of enemies at the gates. That letter was never delivered. The palace burned before help could arrive, its archives sealed in ash. The silence here is tangible. The last voices cut off mid-sentence, preserved in clay but never heard by their intended recipients. It is as if history itself paused, frozen in ruin. To hold such a tablet is to hold silence, a silence that has lasted 3,000 years. In Hattusa, the great capital of the Hittites, silence came differently. Once a sprawling center of power in Anatolia, its walls stretched for miles, enclosing temples and palaces. But by the 12th century BCE, it was abandoned. The archives closed, the priests gone, the kings vanished from record. No fire destroyed it. Suddenly its silence grew more gradual, a fading rather than a single collapse. Yet the result was the same. A city that had once spoken loudly to the world became mute. The silence of Hattusa is less violent, but equally final. Its ruins whisper of absence, of grandeur undone. In Mycenae, the silence is echoed in archaeology through layers of ash. Storerooms filled with oil jars were charred, walls collapsed, weapons left rusting where they fell. The great lion gate still stood, but behind it, the palace had lost its voice. For centuries, the Mycenaean kings had commanded fleets and armies, but with their palace destroyed, command vanished. Without archives or scribes, without granaries or trade, their world unraveled. Farmers continued to work the land, but the larger order was gone. What remained were fragments, villages, memories, echoes of once great halls. The silence of the palace was not the silence of life ending, but of complexity fading. Civilization became smaller, quieter, less connected. Silence also descended on the rituals once held within palace walls. Feasts that had celebrated harvests or honored gods ceased. Music that once echoed through courts fell still. Priests who had led ceremonies scattered, their temples deserted. The palaces had been cultural as well as political centers, shaping identity through ritual and art. When they fell, culture itself was fragmented. The silence here is not just absence of sound, but absence of shared meaning. Without palaces, societies lost a space to define themselves together. Silence became isolation, and isolation reshaped communities. The silence can be seen in broken economies. Palaces had functioned as hubs of redistribution, collecting goods from across their lands and sending them outward again. They stored grain, oil, and cloth, and released them as rations, gifts, or trade. This system required structure scribes, storerooms, officials. When palaces fell, the system collapsed. Trade slowed, surplus vanished, and economies shrank to local scales. Villages fed themselves, but wide networks dissolved. The silence of palaces was also the silence of commerce, the stillness of once busy storerooms standing empty. It was an economic silence, heavy and enduring. Consider the silence of voices lost. Scribes, who once filled clay tablets with symbols, left no successors. Bureaucrats, who managed vast records, disappeared. Generations of knowledge languages, formulas, trade agreements were silenced in a single blaze. The collapse created not just political silence, but intellectual silence. Writing itself diminished in many regions, leaving centuries of gap in records. Oral traditions endured, but the written word grew rare. The palaces had been the guardians of memory, and with their fall, memory itself faltered. The silence of lost words is perhaps the most haunting silence of all. Yet silence is not always empty, it can also be transitional. After the fall of palaces, life continued in smaller, humbler ways. Families rebuilt in villages, communities adapted, new forms of resilience emerged. The silence of grandeur allowed the sounds of ordinary life to rise. The world did not end, it changed. But for those who once looked to the palace as the heart of their world, the loss must have been profound. To live in a world without palaces was to live in a world without the symbols of certainty. Silence became both grief and opportunity, shaping the future in unseen ways. At Tyrans and Pylos, too, the palaces fell into silence. Fires swept through, leaving archives baked, walls blackened, treasures lost. At Pylos, tablets describe preparations for defense just before destruction, warnings of enemies at the shore, instructions for defense. These tablets were baked by fire, preserved by tragedy, and then silence. The warnings became their last words, preserved forever in ash. To walk these ruins today is to feel that silence pressing against you, heavy and unbroken. It is the silence of a story cut short. The silence of palaces also reshaped identity. Kings once claimed divinity, their authority unquestioned within painted halls. When those halls fell, so too did divine kingship. Communities reorganized, leadership became local, often fragile, sometimes contested. The silence of palaces was the end of an era of god-kings. What followed were centuries of humbler authority, defined less by palatial splendor and more by village resilience. This silence was political transformation disguised as absence. A world once ruled by a few became dispersed among many. In the ruins, archaeologists find traces of lives interrupted. Jewelry left behind, weapons dropped, half-finished pottery abandoned. These fragments speak loudly of sudden silence. People fled quickly, leaving their world incomplete. The silence is not gradual here, but abrupt, like a song cut mid-note. The material remains show us that the collapse was lived as shock, as dislocation, as terror. The silence of palaces was not peaceful, it was violent in its suddenness. That violence echoes still in the fragments scattered across the earth. But silence can also be deceptive. For while the palaces themselves were abandoned, life continued beyond their walls. Farmers still tilled soil, herders still tended flocks, children still laughed. The collapse was not an end to humanity, only an end to its grandest structures. The silence we perceive is partly the silence of our own sources. Without palaces, fewer records survive. But the people endured, creating new stories in the shadows of ruins. Silence in history is not absence of life, but absence of record. And in that absence, imagination must fill the gaps. As centuries passed, silence became memory. Ruins stood as reminders of what had been. Myths grew from the fallen palaces, stories of heroes and gods tied to crumbling walls. In Greece, the silence of Mycenae gave rise to legends of Agamemnon, of Troy, of Homer's songs. The palaces may have fallen silent in life, but in story they gained new voices. This transformation from silence to myth ensured that they were never truly forgotten. The quiet halls echoed again, but now with the voices of poets. The silence of palaces carries lessons for us. It reminds us of fragility, of how quickly complexity can unravel. But it also reminds us of resilience, of how people endure beyond grandeur. To walk among ruins is to hear both silence and survival, both absence and presence. The fallen walls whisper of loss, but the earth around them hums with continuity. Silence and sound coexist in history as they do in life. And listening closely, we can hear both. So as you rest tonight, imagine those palaces in silence. Picture the empty courtyards, the broken murals, the storerooms bare. Hear the absence of scribes, of music, of voices. And then, beyond the silence, imagine the small sounds of survival. Footsteps in villages, laughter of children, whispers of stories by firelight. The palaces may have fallen, but life did not. In their silence, the lullaby of humanity continued, softer but unbroken. Let that lullaby carry you into rest. When great kingdoms collapse, they rarely leave behind full stories. Instead, what survives are fragments, broken walls, scattered pottery, tablets half-baked by fire. The late Bronze Age did not vanish into nothing, but into pieces. Archaeologists today sift through these fragments, piecing together a picture of a world once whole. It is like holding shards of a vase, beautiful still, but incomplete. Memory of the age is carried in fragments, and through them, we try to listen to voices otherwise lost. These fragments are fragile, yet they are all we have, and in their silence, they whisper still. Pottery shards are among the most common finds. To us, they may look ordinary broken bowls, cracked jars, fragments of cups, but in their clay, archaeologists read stories. The shape of a rim reveals trade connections. The texture of clay reveals origin. The decoration reveals culture. A fragment from Cyprus found in Greece tells of exchange, of connection across the sea. A piece of Mycenaean pottery in the Levant speaks of networks still alive, even as kingdoms faltered. Each shard is a piece of memory, a clue to a world otherwise gone. These fragments are the syllables of history, tablets, to survive in fragments. Some are whole, their cuneiform clear, their messages preserved. Others are broken, incomplete, words cut off mid-sentence. One letter may end abruptly, leaving us to wonder what came next. These broken tablets are haunting because they preserve not only what was written, but also what was lost. They are memory interrupted, silence intruding upon speech. And yet, even fragments of words tell us much. They reveal fear, hope, negotiation, and survival. Through fragments, we catch echoes of conversations once alive. They are whispers in clay, fragile but enduring. Architecture, too, is remembered in fragments. Walls stand half-collapsed, stairways leading nowhere, doorways opening into rubble, palaces reduced to foundations, temples to scattered stones. Yet even ruins reveal greatness. The thickness of a wall shows defense. The breadth of a hall shows ceremony. Through fragments, we measure ambition, skill, and imagination. Walking through these ruins, one feels the silence of absence, but also the presence of memory. These stones once held voices, and though broken, they continue to tell their story. Memory in fragments is memory still. The natural world also carries fragments of memory. In pollen grains preserved in lake beds, scientists read the story of drought. In tree rings, they trace years of plenty and years of scarcity. In charred seeds from storerooms, they find the remains of lost harvests. These are fragments not of objects, but of environment. They tell us what people ate, what they lost, what they feared. These natural fragments are vital because they remind us that collapse was not only political but ecological. Memory survives in the smallest details, in grains, in rings, in ashes. The fragments of nature carry the weight of history. Some fragments are accidental gifts of tragedy. Fires that destroyed palaces hardened clay tablets, preserving them for millennia. Ash sealed storerooms, leaving jars intact beneath rubble. Violence, though destructive, sometimes created memory. What was burned was also preserved. Archaeologists uncover these fragments like time capsules sealed by disaster. They remind us that collapse is paradoxical. It destroys, but it also preserves. The memory we hold today is shaped by catastrophe, carried to us through the accidents of survival. Fragments are not only what remain, they are what endured. In museums today, fragments are displayed carefully behind glass. A single piece of pottery, no bigger than your hand, is given space and light. Visitors lean in, studying its patterns, imagining the whole vessel it once belonged to. In this act of attention, fragments regain dignity. They are no longer broken, they are honored. The same is true for tablets, each inscribed wedge, now studied like a precious jewel. Fragments, though incomplete, still hold power. They connect us to the lives of people long gone. They show us that even broken things can speak if we are willing to listen closely. Memory survives in what is left, not only in what is whole. The myths that emerged after the collapse are also fragments of memory. Oral traditions preserved echoes of the palaces, kings, and wars. In Greece, legends of Agamemnon, Achilles, and Troy may have carried faint reflections of the Mycenaean world. These stories are not precise history, but memory reshaped, broken into pieces, and reassembled by imagination. Myth is another form of fragment, one that carries truth in symbolic form. It shows us that memory does not disappear, transforms. The palaces may have fallen silent, but their echoes found new voices in song. Fragments of memory became stories for generations. Archaeologists often speak of context. A fragment alone tells little, but its placement tells much. A shard in a rubbish heap reveals daily life. A piece of ivory in a palace storeroom reveals wealth and trade. Context turns fragments into narrative. It allows us to piece together the story of a world from its remains. Memory in fragments is not chaotic. It is structured by careful attention. Each find adds another note to the chorus, helping us hear the voices of the past more clearly. The fragments may never give us the full song, but they give us enough to hum along. The The silence between fragments is also part of memory. What is missing shapes our imagination as much as what remains. Gaps in records, absent voices, destroyed archivisal leave space for wonder, for speculation. Silence invites us to ask questions, to fill the void with empathy. In this way, memory in fragments is alive. It invites participation. We become part of the story, piecing together lives from scattered clues. History is not only what is preserved, but how we respond to what is lost. Fragments engage us in dialogue across time. There is beauty in fragments. The curve of a broken bowl, the faint paint on a chipped fresco, the half-fated words on a tablet all remind us of impermanence. They teach us that nothing endures whole forever, yet even broken they retain beauty. A shard of pottery may still bear the handprint of its maker, pressed thousands of years ago. A fragment of wall painting may still show a vivid hue of blue, defying centuries of decay. Beauty persists, even in pieces. Memory is not diminished by fragmentation, it is deepened. It asks us to look closer, to notice details we might overlook in completeness. Fragments also remind us of resilience. Though kingdoms collapsed, though palaces burned, something always survived. A jar buried in ash, a story retold by firelight, a seed preserved in soil. These small survivals show the stubbornness of memory. They show that even when systems fail, traces remain. And those traces can be enough to rebuild, to remember, to continue. Fragmented memory is not absence, it is continuity in another form. It carries the promise that even when much is lost, something endures. That endurance is the heartbeat of history. The discovery of fragments is itself part of their story. When archaeologists dig, they kneel in silence, brushing earth from tiny pieces. Each fragment uncovered is like a whisper emerging from the ground. There is reverence in this work, patience and care. To recover fragments is to restore voices. It is an act of listening, of giving the past a chance to speak again. The process is slow, meticulous, but it mirrors the slowness of memory itself. Fragments do not shout, they wait quietly until someone is ready to hear them. For the people of the time, fragments may also have carried meaning. A broken tool could be reforged, a shattered pot repurposed, a ruin reused as shelter. To live amid fragments is to adapt. The survivors of collapse must have seen ruins not as symbols of despair, but as resources. Stones from palaces became walls for homes. Shards became tools. Memory lived in reuse as much as in reverence. Fragments are not only reminders of what was lost, they are foundations for what comes next. In this way, fragments are both past and future. As centuries passed, fragments became layered. New generations built upon ruins, their own lives leaving traces atop the older ones. Memory in fragments thus became memory in strata, one layer upon another. Archaeology uncovers this layering, showing us not only collapse but renewal. Each fragment belongs to a larger cycle, part of a rhythm of rise and fall. Memory in fragments is not only about endings, it is about continuity through change. Fragments hold the echoes of many ages at once. They are the chorus of time itself. Tonight, as you rest, think of fragments as lullabies. Each shard, each tablet, each ruin is a note in a song of memory. Together, they create a melody broken, yes, but still beautiful. Let that melody drift into your thoughts, gentle and soft. It reminds us that history is not always whole, but it is always present. The fragments speak in whispers, and if we listen closely, we can hear them. They tell us of resilience, of beauty, of survival. They are the memory of a world once vast, now carried in pieces, and in their brokenness, they soothe us into sleep. The fall of the great palaces did not bring an instant end to the world of the late Bronze Age. Collapse is rarely sudden everywhere at once. Instead, it was a twilighter, slow dimming of lights across the Mediterranean. Some cities burned in a single night, their silence abrupt and final. Others lingered for years, fading gradually as trade dwindled and resources thinned. The twilight stretched long, uncertain, leaving survivors to wonder whether the old ways might return. It is this twilight, more than the moment of collapse itself, that defines the ending of the age. Twilight is not dark, but it is no longer bright. It is a time of memory, of adjustment, of uneasy survival. Imagine living in a city after its palace had burned. The great halls lay in ruins, but homes still stood, fields still produced, children still played. Life continued, but diminished. The markets were smaller, the goods fewer, the connections weaker. Where once ships from Cyprus, Egypt, and Crete had arrived, now fewer sails touched the harbour. A community that had once been part of a vast network now turned inward, relying on its own land, its own people. The twilight was not silence, but it was quieter, more fragile. It was life stripped of grandeur, continuing in humble form. In this twilight, memory became both comfort and burden. Elders remembered when the palaces were alive, when letters and gifts connected distant rulers. They told stories of kings and trade, of feasts and battles. Younger generations listened, growing up in a smaller, narrower world. For them, the memories of abundance must have seemed like legends, too grand to believe. The twilight was thus a time of both remembering and forgetting. Memories glowed like embers, fading slowly, carried forward in fragments of story. The long twilight was history becoming myth before the eyes of those who lived it. Economies shrank during this twilight. Once vast redistributive systems broke down. Palaces that had coordinated trade were gone, leaving smaller communities to manage on their own. Farmers fed themselves, merchants bartered locally, craftsmen worked for villagers rather than kings. Bronze, once the lifeblood of the age, became scarcer as trade routes faltered. In its place, iron began to appear harder to forge, but more accessible locally. This shift marked not just adaptation but transformation. The twilight was not only decline, it was also the birth of something new. Yet for those living through it, the change felt like loss, like the dimming of a familiar world. The long twilight was also marked by migration. People moved into new lands, searching for fertile soil, safer homes, stronger walls. Refugees from fallen cities carried skills, traditions, and memories with them. They built new communities, blending old ways with new needs. These migrations reshaped cultures, creating hybrids where once there had been distinctions. The twilight was thus a time of mixing, of adaptation born from necessity. It was not a golden age, but it was creative in its own quiet way. Out of loss emerged new beginnings, faint but persistent. Twilight, though dim, still carries light. The letters of the age grow fewer during this twilight. Archives closed with the fall of palaces, scribes dispersed, bureaucracies dissolved. Yet, in a few places, the practice of writing endured. These last voices are precious, carrying echoes of the old system into the twilight. They remind us that memory is not always lost suddenly. It lingers in scraps, in late attempts to preserve order. Reading them is like hearing a voice calling across a fading horizon. They tell us that even as the world grew smaller, people still reached outward, still hoped for connection. Twilight is never total silence, it is the echo of what came before. In the long twilight, art and craftsmanship changed as well. Without vast palace workshops, artisans worked in smaller spaces, producing for local needs rather than distant courts. The grandeur of gold ornaments gave way to simpler designs, humbler materials, and practical objects. Yet within this simplicity there was beauty: patterns carved carefully, pottery painted with care, textiles woven with patience. Twilight did not end creativity, it redirected it. Instead of serving kings, art now served families and communities. The fragments of this twilight show a quieter aesthetic, one rooted in survival but not devoid of grace. Even in decline, humanity creates, shaping beauty from scarcity. Religion, too, adapted to twilight. Great temples tied to palaces fell silent, their priests gone, their rituals interrupted. But smaller shrines appeared in villages, households kept altars, and families prayed in private. The gods did not vanish. They became more intimate, closer to the hearth than the hall. This shift in worship reflects the broader change of the age, from grand, centralized structures to local, personal resilience. Twilight meant a more modest spirituality, grounded in daily survival. The silence of great temples was balanced by the whispers of countless small prayers, carried upward in simplicity. In twilight, warfare also transformed. Large armies commanded by palaces became rarer. Instead, smaller groups defended villages, guarded farmlands, and fought for survival. The scale of war diminished, but the frequency may have grown as smaller communities struggled over scarce resources. Without central power, conflict became fragmented, scattered across the landscape. The ruins bear traces of this: fortifications built hastily, weapons left in local graves. Twilight was not peaceful, but it was less organized. Violence remained, but it was the violence of small fires rather than great conflagrations. The twilight was a world of many struggles rather than one great struggle. Trade shrank but never vanished. Even in twilight, merchants carried goods, though the distances were shorter, the risks greater. Small harbors still saw ships arrive, but the networks of old were gone. Instead of gold and ivory, trade might consist of grain, salt, or simple pottery. The scale diminished, but exchange endured. People always seek connection, always look to share what they have for what they need. Twilight is not isolation, it is reduced connection, fragile but present. These smaller trades laid the groundwork for new systems that would rise in the centuries to come. Twilight carried within it the seeds of dawn. The twilight also left space for storytelling. Without palaces to store archives, memory passed more fully into oral tradition. Around fires, families retold tales of kings and heroes, of battles and journeys. These stories, shaped by time, grew into myths. In Greece, the twilight after the Mycenaean palaces gave rise to epic songs that carried memory through poetry. Twilight was thus fertile ground for imagination. The silence of scribes was replaced by the voices of singers. Memory shifted form but did not die. Twilight preserved history in myth, ensuring that the grandeur of the past lived on in legend. Archaeology shows us twilight in layers of continuity. Villages remained, fields were still ploughed, pottery was still made. But above these continuities lay scars: burned palaces, abandoned archives, collapsed walls. Twilight is visible as contrast survival beside ruin, persistence beside loss. This mixture is what defines the period. It was neither full collapse nor full continuity, but something in between. A long dusk where both endings and beginnings coexisted. To study twilight is to study ambiguity, a time that cannot be captured in a single image, but must be understood in fragments. The psychological weight of twilight must have been heavy. To live after collapse is to live with memory. Survivors carried grief for what was lost, uncertainty for what lay ahead, and responsibility for rebuilding. Twilight is not only historically, is emotional. The people of the age did not know they were living in decline. They only knew they were living with less than before. That awareness, sharpened by stories of the old world, must have colored their lives with longing. Twilight is history as lived melancholy, the slow fading of brightness into shadow. Yet twilight is also resilience. Communities endured, children grew into adults, adults into elders, life continuing in quieter rhythms. The absence of grandeur did not mean the absence of meaning. Smaller lives, though less recorded, were no less full of humanity. People still loved, still laughed, still celebrated harvests, still mourned their dead. Twilight reminds us that history is not only about what collapses, but about what persists. In the shadows of ruin, life continued, steady and unrecorded. This persistence is its own kind of strength. The twilight also gave space for change. Iron began to replace bronze. Local leaders rose in place of distant kings. New languages and scripts emerged. These developments were small at first, but they marked the beginning of new chapters. Twilight is both an ending and a threshold. What looks like decline from afar may have felt like transformation from within. Out of twilight grew the seeds of the Iron Age, the foundations for cultures that would later flourish. The dusk of one world was the dawn of another. History always moves in cycles. When we look back, twilight is harder to see than collapse. Fires leave dramatic evidence, ruins make clear statements. But twilight is subtle, quieter, less obvious. It is the empty space between, the slow fading rather than the sudden fall. To study twilight is to study patience, to listen to silence as carefully as to noise. Twilight teaches us that history is not always dramatic, it is often gradual. It asks us to attend to nuance, to the soft tones between bright and dark. Twilight is where endings blur into beginnings. So tonight, as you rest, think of twilight not as loss but as transition. Imagine the long dusk after the collapse of palaces, the slow dimming of grandeur, the persistence of ordinary lives. Picture families gathering around fires, telling stories of the past while living into an uncertain future. Twilight is not silence, it is the hum of continuity, quieter but steady, and in that hum is comfort, the reassurance that even as worlds change, life goes on. Let this twilight lullaby guide you into sleep, soft and enduring, like embers glowing in the dark. The year 1177 BCE has become a symbol. Historians mark it as the turning point, the moment when the interconnected world of the late Bronze Age unraveled. It is not a single year of catastrophe everywhere, but a shorthand for twilight turning into night. By this time, palaces had burned, letters had grown silent, and trade had withered. The networks of kings and merchants that had bound the Mediterranean together had frayed beyond repair. And yet, in this silence, a lullaby remains, the echoes of what once was, sung softly by ruins, carried gently by memory. Imagine the world before 1177. ships crisscrossing the sea, letters flying from palace to palace, gifts glittering in torchlight. A web stretched wide, fragile yet vibrant, binding Egypt, Hatti, Mycenae, Ugarit, Babylon. Then picture the world after. Ships fewer, harbors empty, palaces in ashes, letters broken mid-sentence, the hum of connection replaced by silence. 1177 is the hinge between these two visions, the year when history tilted. But tilt does not mean end. The lullaby of 1177 reminds us that even in collapse, life endures, carrying forward quieter songs. In Egypt, Pharaoh Ramesses III fought the sea peoples and declared victory. His inscriptions show ships locked in battle, enemies defeated. Egypt survived, but survival was costly. The empire shrank, its wealth diminished, its reach narrower than before. The lullaby of 1177 is not triumph, but survival tempered with loss. Even the greatest kingdom could not emerge untouched. The stones of temples still stood, but behind them the rhythms of life had changed forever. Twilight had deepened, even in the land of the Nile. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces lay in ruins. Mycenae, Chirins, Pylos, all burned or abandoned. The kings vanished, their archives lost, their halls silent. Yet villages endured, farmers continued, shepherds tended flocks. This was the beginning of the Greek Dark Age, but also the soil from which later traditions would grow. The lullaby of 1177 here is one of humility, greatness reduced to fragments, fragments carried into myth. Out of silence came stories, Homer's epics, legends of heroes that transformed memory into poetry. Twilight gave birth to song. In Anatolia, Hattusa was abandoned. The once mighty Hittite empire faded into silence, its capital left to crumble. Letters ceased, treaties dissolved, temples closed. Yet its people did not vanish entirely. Some migrated south, their language echoing faintly in smaller states that followed. The lullaby here is of echoes, faint but persistent, reminders that no collapse is total. Even in disappearance, traces remain, voices carry forward. Twilight gave way to silence, but silence was not absolute. The world shifted, but it did not end. Ugarit, on the Levantine coast, provides the most haunting note of the lullaby. Its final letters were left in kilns, unfinished, undelivered. One pleads desperately for aid, warning of enemies at the gates. It was never read by its intended ally. The city burned, its people scattered, its palace silenced. The lullaby of Ugarit is a broken melody, cut off mid-song, preserved in ash. To hold such a letter today is to hold the weight of a last word, a voice silenced yet still whispering. It is the sadness of twilight, captured forever, yet across the ruins, continuity remained. Farmers ploughed fields, potters shaped clay, children played. Collapse does not erase humanity, it reshapes it. The lullaby of 1177 is gentle because it reminds us of resilience. The world shrank, but it endured. The great connections dissolved, but smaller ones persisted. People rebuilt, adapted, changed. Twilight became night, but night carries stars. The lullaby is sung not in despair, but in quiet persistence, the hum of survival in the face of loss. Archaeology captures this lullaby in fragments of daily life. Broken pottery still lies where it was once used, charred seeds remain in abandoned storerooms, and bones tell of meals once shared. These are not grand monuments, but quiet reminders that life continued even after collapse. The lullaby of 1177 is found in these ordinary traces, small notes in the larger song of history. They remind us that collapse is not total silence, but the fading of one melody while another begins. The ruins hum softly, not with grandeur, but with resilience. The lullaby also exists in myths. The memory of lost kingdoms was reshaped into legend. The Greek epics recall the fall of Troy, echoing the collapse of Mycenaean palaces. Stories of wandering heroes reflect the migrations and displacements of the age. These myths are not history in detail, but they carry the emotional truth of the time. They are the voices of twilight transformed into poetry, carried forward long after the palaces were gone. In this way, the lullaby of 1177 survived in song, even when written words had faded. Memory endured in rhythm and rhyme. The lullaby is also a reminder of fragility. The interconnected world of the late Bronze Age seemed strong, tied by letters, gifts, and trade. Yet beneath the glitter lay dependence on rains, on trust, on balance. When drought struck, when raiders arrived, when alliances faltered, the fabric unraveled. The lullaby of 1177 whispers that complexity is delicate, that greatness rests on fragile foundations. It is a cautionary melody, soft but insistent, reminding us that every age is vulnerable, even ours. But alongside fragility, the lullaby carries hope. History shows that collapse is never the end. Out of the ruins of 1177 came new societies, new languages, new ways of living. Iron replaced bronze, local leaders rose, communities adapted. The lullaby of 1177 is therefore not only about loss, it is about renewal. It sings of endings, yes, but also of beginnings hidden within them. Twilight gave way to night, but night gave way to dawn. The song of history is never finished. Picture yourself standing among the ruins of a fallen palace. The walls are broken, the courtyards empty. Yet in the cracks, grass grows. Birds nest in the stones. Children of later generations play where kings once ruled. The lullaby of 1177 is this juxtaposition, the silence of collapse and the sound of life returning. Ruins are not only reminders of death, but of persistence. They hum softly with continuity, with the rhythm of life that never fully disappears. Even today, the year 1177 speaks to us. Historians use it as a marker, a shorthand for a vast and complex unraveling. But beyond the date, it is the human stories that matter, the letters unanswered, the gifts undelivered, the ships that never arrived. These stories are the notes of the lullaby, preserved in clay, in ruins, in memory. They remind us that history is not abstract, it is human. And the lullaby of 1177 carries the humanity of those who lived, struggled, and endured. The lullaby also carries silence as part of its melody. Where letters once flowed, silence grew. Where palaces once thrived, ruins stood empty. Yet silence is not absence. It is part of the song. It allows us to listen more carefully, to notice the fragments that remain. The lullaby of 1177 is woven from both sound and silence, from both what survives and what is lost. It is a song that asks us to listen gently, patiently, without rushing, and in that quiet, history reveals itself. For us, the lullaby is a mirror. It reflects the fragility of our own systems, the importance of trust, the danger of imbalance. But it also reflects our resilience, our ability to adapt, to rebuild, to carry memory forward. Listening to the lullaby of 1177 is not only about the past, it is about ourselves. It asks us to slow down, to reflect, to find humility in the lessons of history. It is a song for sleepless minds, a reminder that fragility and resilience walk hand in hand. As you drift tonight, let this lullaby settle around you. Picture the ships upon a quiet sea, the palaces in silence, the fragments in the earth. Hear the voices of kings, of scribes, of ordinary people carried faintly across time. Their world ended, but their memory remains, singing softly in the ruins. The lullaby of 1177 is not dramatic, not loud, it is gentle, persistent, eternal. It hums like wind through broken walls, like waves against abandoned shores. It is the song of history itself, guiding us into rest. So close your eyes and listen. The year 1177 is far behind us, yet its lullaby reaches across centuries. It tells of collapse and survival, of silence and resilience. It reminds us that history, like sleep, is a cycle of endings and beginnings. Let the fragments, the ruins, the whispers of clay carry you gently into dreams. For even in twilight there is song, even in ruin there is memory, and in this lullaby of 1177 you are cradled softly by time. Sleep now, wrapped in its quiet embrace.